I always thought my best friend Alex came from a pretty typical family. Sure, they were a bit offbeat, a little reclusive, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I mean, they lived out in the woods, on the edge of town, in this big, old house that always seemed to have more of an unsettling presence than I cared to admit. But Alex was my buddy, and I never really thought too much about his family's eccentricities. That all changed one weekend when I decided to stay over at his place. It was a Saturday afternoon when I arrived, and Alex's parents, his mom, Janet, and his dad, Mark, were there to greet me. They seemed friendly enough, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. They kept asking questions that felt invasive, like they were trying to know more about my life than necessary. I brushed it off, thinking they were just being overprotective. Alex had warned me before that his parents were a little old-fashioned, so I figured it was just that. We spent the evening hanging out in his room, playing games, and catching up. But when dinner time came, Alex's parents invited me to eat with them. And that's when things started to get strange. Dinner was served in a large rustic dining room with wood panel walls and a long, heavy table. The food looked normal enough: pot roast, vegetables, mashed potatoes, but there was something unsettling about the way it was served. The meat was darker than usual, and the scent was oddly pungent. I thought maybe it was just the spices they used, or the fact that the house had that lingering woodsy smell, but I felt a slight discomfort as I picked up my fork. Alex's parents seemed unusually eager for me to eat. They were practically watching me, almost like they were waiting for me to approve. I tried to mask my unease with forced conversation, but every time I glanced up, they were staring at me. Not in a friendly way, but with a cold intensity I couldn't ignore. Then, after the meal, Alex's dad, Mark, stood up and said something that made my heart freeze. "Why don't you go ahead and relax in the living room?" he said, his voice too smooth, too controlled. "We'll clean up and join you in a minute. There's something we want to show you." At this point, I was starting to feel weird. I'd been there for hours, but the atmosphere was growing more and more suffocating, and I felt like I was being pushed into something I didn't understand. I agreed and excused myself, walking into the living room, where an old, cracked television sat in the corner. I sat there alone for what felt like an eternity. When Alex's parents finally joined me, they weren't carrying any dishes, which struck me as odd. They sat across from me in silence, watching me like hawks. "Do you like the meal, son?" Mark asked, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah, it was good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A little rich, but it was fine." They nodded, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Then, out of nowhere, Janet spoke. "You know, we've been meaning to have you over for a while," she said, her tone suddenly too casual. "Alex always speaks so highly of you. We wanted to show you our little family tradition." I frowned, confused. Family tradition? Mark stood up slowly, the smile fading from his face. "You see, we've been doing things a certain way for generations. It's important to us." Before I could ask what the hell he meant, everything clicked in place, like a switch turning in my brain. They weren't just being weird. They weren't just eccentric. They were hungry. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked around, frantic, trying to find an escape, but the door was too far, and they were closing in on me. Mark walked behind me, his footsteps slow, deliberate. Janet came up to my side, gently, as if comforting me. "You're the guest of honor, you know," she said in a soft, almost affectionate tone. "You've been such a good friend to Alex. He's always talked about you. We just wanted to show our appreciation." Suddenly, I remembered something, a brief memory of an old conversation with Alex, where he mentioned how his family really took care of their guests, how the house had been passed down through generations. I had thought it was just a weird joke, but now, in that moment, I knew the truth, and it was too late. Mark and Janet both grinned at me, wide and sharp. They had been waiting for me. My blood turned to ice as I realized what they were about to do. I was the next meal. I lunged toward the door, but Mark grabbed me by the arm, his grip like iron. His eyes glinted with dark amusement. "You didn't think we'd just let you leave, did you?" That's when Alex walked into the room, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe. Maybe he'd stop them. Maybe he'd call for help. But then I saw his face. His expression wasn't one of surprise. It wasn't one of guilt either. It was something far darker. He smiled. "You really thought you were just having dinner with us, didn't you?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to narrow into a suffocating blackness as the walls seemed to close in, and the last thing I heard before everything went dark was Alex's voice. "We're a family, after all, and family takes care of each other." I was frozen in fear, staring at Alex, my best friend, the one person I thought I could trust, standing there, grinning as if this whole twisted situation was just a joke. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. How could I have been so blind? The tension in the room was suffocating, and the air felt thick with anticipation, like they were savoring the moment. Mark's grip tightened on my arm, dragging me back from the door. Janet's eyes gleamed with something primal, something that made my skin crawl. I knew I had only moments before this family's tradition became my own nightmare. As Mark began to drag me toward the kitchen, my mind scrambled for any way out. But the house was huge, isolated, and I was outnumbered. My thoughts raced back to the conversation I'd had with Alex, how he'd always made strange comments about his family being different. I should have caught on earlier. It wasn't just their weirdness, it was their predatory nature. Then I remembered something. Earlier, when we were at the dinner table, I'd noticed an old-fashioned carving knife resting beside the meat platter. It had been on the far side of the table, right next to the cabinet. Something about the way Mark's eyes flicked to it as he sat down. It made me uneasy, like he was watching me for a reaction. The knife had been gleaming under the light, and now, in that moment, it was the only thing that could save me. I took a slow, deep breath, pretending to be defeated. The whole time, my hand was inching toward the back of the chair where I had been sitting. I had to make it seem like I was giving up, like I was going to comply. "Please let me go," I muttered, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude. Just let me leave, and I'll forget all about this." Mark chuckled, dragging me a few steps closer to the kitchen. "It's too late for that, son. You've already been invited. You're part of the family now." It was then that I felt it, the slight shift in my position as I leaned back against the chair, my hand finally brushing the handle of the carving knife. My heart raced. I had one shot at this. I couldn't let them see my desperation. I couldn't let them know I was planning anything. With a sudden burst of strength, I jerked my arm free from Mark's grip, making it seem like a last-ditch attempt to break free. He wasn't expecting it, and for a split second, his hold loosened. In that moment, I grabbed the carving knife, swinging it back at Mark, my breath coming in frantic bursts. Without a second thought, I bolted toward the back door, the cold night air hitting my face as I pushed it open with all my strength. The house seemed to groan behind me, like it was angry I was trying to escape. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran as fast as I could, my heart racing, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where a car happened to pass by. The driver saw me, a disheveled, terrified mess, and immediately pulled over. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his eyes wide with concern. I couldn't even answer. I just collapsed into the passenger seat, my body shaking uncontrollably as the car sped off. It wasn't until later, when I was safely back in town, that I realized how close I came to becoming part of their twisted tradition. Part of me still can't wrap my head around what happened that night. How Alex, my best friend, wasn't just a victim like me, but part of it all. He didn't stop his family. He didn't even try to warn me. I don't know what happened to them after I escaped, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is I never want to see that house again. And I'll never forget the cold, empty smile on Alex's face as they closed in on me. That family is out there somewhere, waiting for the next guest to wander too close. And I'm pretty sure they're still waiting for me.